Well, first of all, I'm very thrilled to be here today at the Creative Study Lab, creating shared futures through contested heritages. As a part of the project Taking Care, ethnographic and world cultures, museums and spaces of care, which has many important partner institutions like the Museo delle Civiltà, which is also our host today. Before I start, I really want to thank Loretta, the executive director, for inviting me. Anna Maria Pecci, who has been very sweet and punctual in all the process of the organization of this event. Rosanna Dilella, but also the IT staff and the project's partner. And of course, my colleagues who will be speaking later on today. So this lecture, as Dr. Loretta Paderni said, draws largely from my last book, Monsters, Catastrophes in the Anthropocene, where I developed a post-colonial critique to some material and symbolic dispositives that reproduce specific colonial discourses and power relations. It is composed of two parts. The first focuses on the three different yet interrelated crises that what I call the Western we sees as caused by the spillover of migrations, terrorism, and catastrophes into its safe space. In this view, these phenomena are interpreted as if they were generated in a sort of a elsewhere and out there, which corresponds to the formerly colonized world. The three crises I'm investigating are those generated by the end of history, geography, and humanity that the Western we has constructed since modernity. In its second part, my paper proposes a feminist decolonial political project based on care, self-care, and earth care, which is seen as the only possible radical response to the three crises and the very foundation, if we want, of an epistemology of resistance against the Anthropocene. The we I'm referring to incorporates diverse political dynamics, social processes, and geographies from Europe and its nation states, as well as those from transatlantic ties to the rest of the West and the broader global North. So encompassing, but also transversal to state, nation, and global geographies. As such, the roots of the we lie in a vast realm of converging and diverging cultural elements, narratives and self-narratives, which I nevertheless see as crystallizing into a single voice at certain historical moments when homogeneous narratives and policies on migration, the war on terror, and environmental catastrophes are deployed to structure the way the we conceives of and responds to the threat. It is in times like those that the we is made into a consolidated imagined community. Just as in the wake of 9/11 or during the COVID-19 pandemic, a shared history and a common future are invoked to legitimize emergency measures on the basis of a certain political and international acknowledgement of its common destiny. The we can operate as a semiotic dispositif capable of developing convergent strategies and common actions against the migrant so-called invasion, terrorism, and catastrophes. But why Europe? Why is Europe the core of my analysis? First of all, because of a politics of location. Being a feminist is not just an issue of ethics, it's an issue of the ontology as an intellectual and an activist to perform a politics of location. So being myself an European and white, I need to start from where I speak, from my own background, in order to unveil the non-neutrality, non-universality of my knowledge. Second, Europe and the West established the parameters to define democracy, human and civil rights, citizenship, humanitarianism, monstrosity, catastrophes, terrorism, even what is valuable in terms of art, and what is conceived the threat that Europe and the West are facing today. Then, of course, being an Italian, speaking from a place in the world that is obviously Southern Europe, also because I'm living my place for, let's say, my current life is Portugal. So there is a proximity, a geographical proximity, which is also an epistemological proximity to the place, let's say, the spaces seen as generating and bringing catastrophes and monsters into the space of the we. The background from where I analyze this we is one of political philosophy. My method connects a post-colonial critique to an intersectional approach and uses critical visual studies as well as critical security and border studies, critical discourse analysis of iconographies, and mainstream visual discourses on human mobility, terrorism, and catastrophes have been applied to news media, photojournalism, cinema, and television productions, also within the field work that I conducted, but within the 3 years project that Loretta mentioned, the othering, the constructive risk and otherness, hegemonic scripts and counter-narratives on migrants, refugee, and so-called internal others in Portuguese and European mediascapes, of which I am the PI. In particular, within this project, my analysis aimed to understand which imaginary underpins the three discursively constructed yet material crises, and in which way they might structure or rather subvert ideas of Europe and the West as isolated, innocent, and at siege, and ideas of their others as inherently monstrous and therefore expendable. In my articulation, the three crises under scrutiny are human-generated, but also intrinsically environmental. Assuming that the environment is a social phenomenon and assuming the interdependence and interactivity of all biological, physical elements, as well as power relations structuring life on the planet, even terrorism is intrasystemically generated by human and not human factors, as Andrew Telford's essay on the climate terrorism assemblage has highlighted recently in 2020. But their interconnectedness is not only related to materiality, it is symbolic, tied up to Western scientific epistemology, of which, nonetheless, the triple crisis of the end of history, the end of geography, and the end of the idea of humanity of the Western we represent also an inherent subversion. The end of the history of the we, that in my view, both migrations, the terrorist threats, and the Anthropocenic catastrophes are causing, consists in the unveiling of the global North's violent narrative of the common destiny according to which this we sees chaos only coming from out there, as if the latter was inherently ridden with violence and monstrosity and threatening the we's security, wealth, health, well-being, and identity. As if Europe and the West were the places where disasters occur by chance, but can be mastered because of Western rationality and technoscience. The end of the geography of the we has to do with the image of migrants, terrorism, and catastrophes violating the boundaries that define the here and the out there as separated and opposed. In my view, a binary rhetoric locating forgettable disasters beyond the borders of the worthy imaginary community of the we, on the other side of the gate separating visibility from invisibility, differentiate between places of disaster where catastrophe can be controlled and therefore overcome, and places for disaster where disaster is part of people's daily life. Places of disaster, which are the places where the we lives and from where it moves, are places where disasters and catastrophes are deemed as not systemic. On the contrary, places for disaster are those places out there where the we believes disaster to be endemic and essentially linked to the backwardness, poverty, lack of knowledge and skills of the unknown, irrational, dangerous, non-civilized monster. These are forgettable places, invisibilized garbage lands, whose inhabitants live together with not human life and not life, using Povinelli's categories, as not or less meaningful than meaningful. Nonetheless, the opposition between places of disaster and places for disaster does not coincide with the geographical distinction between global north and global south. or between former colonial metropoles and peripheries. At the geographical level, many places, people, and territories are not in non-conforming, not extractivist, nor border epistemologies in the so-called global north have been disregarded or disciplined, erased, or criminalized in order to conform them to both value extraction and a narrative of isolation from the rest. Drawing from my research at the othering and on the Italian case in particular, I can only mention the expendability of factory workers in petrochemical and asbestos-based industrial compounds in the north as well as in the south of Italy, thinking, of course, about Mestre, Napoli, Torino, Taranto, etc. Most mortality for cancer is depoliticized and disregarded. The expendable population exposed to hydrogeological catastrophes, think about the Bayonne Dam accident, but also the criminalization of no-border grassroots solidarity at sea and in cities in the south of Italy, like in the case of Riace, and the criminalization of mass protests against infrastructures that damage the environment. It's the case, for instance, of the no-VAT movements in the north of Italy. This very blurred, abyssal line, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos would call it, between global north and global south, which identifies those who belong to the we, at the same time implies that a differential degree of violence is deployed in different places for disaster, according to their location in colonial and post-colonial history. This violence reaches its peak when people and territories which are disregarded and massacred belong to the colonial and post-colonial out there. In this case, not only the level of violence is unbearable and invisibilized, but it is also structural and genocidary in the first place. From an archival viewpoint, in colonial narratives, the discovered lands were a place for disaster in which indigenous people were overwhelmed by natural and human-generated calamities that they were unable to master as they did not have the necessary culture, race, religion, and expertise. In the post-colonial world, disasters occur where technology is lacking or improperly used, which is outside the space of or the space controlled by the we. Today, the we is public discourse, meaning institutional and mainstream media, as well as mainstream cultural productions representing the three crises, see the people on the move from the former colonized world towards the West as a horde of barbarous enemies against which a language of war is constantly deployed. Similarly, it represents catastrophes like SARS-2 COVID-19 pandemic as the result of the mismanagement of technology in places governed by a bad version of capitalism only possible in the out there. And terrorism as the outcome of backwardness and ungenerated in the out there and elsewhere, which very rarely is seen as a complex phenomenon that interrogates the we and its local and global power relations. The binary of places of disaster and places for disaster prepares and legitimizes unlockable and irresponsible value extraction and extractivism of both places for disaster and their inhabitants. Disposable places, which are treated like disposable places and people for which disaster are deemed to be due to their backwardness rather than neoliberalism and Western-centric disaster management protocols and agreements. Migrations, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic and terrorism, symbolically challenge such binary. They all subvert the distinction between safe and unsafe, worthy and expendable, and bring the omen of the end of humanity to the core of the global north. By humanity, I mean the we with the right to look, the we that embodies the so-called anthropocenic anthropos. That is the we that the anthropocenic ontology places at the center of the world. By the end of humanity, I mean the end of an idea of the world as dominated by the anthropocenic anthropos that materializes in the Western we, alongside the internal and external hierarchies and inequalities that sustain this view. Moreover, the virus apparent restless mutation, multiple and undetected ways of transmission seem to question the we's ability to dominate nature and preserve itself from disasters. Although the anthropocenic idea of the human as mastering nature and as invincible vacillates in mainstream media and public discourse, the we does not admit that the monster is not the invisible enemy, nor the visible plague spreader identified by right-wing movement and parties as the migrant, but anthropocenic ontologies and logics. Firstly, through the separation of culture and nature, world and planet, the normative, culturally hegemonic, dominant man and his rest. On the contrary, trapped in its own logic, when faced with its own vulnerability to the effects of the Anthropocene, the we cannot but accelerate the catastrophe and place the we time and again at the center of the scene. Let's think, for instance, to the hegemonic visual imaginary of the catastrophe diffused in the West, and particularly on those depicting the pandemic crisis. In many post-apocalyptic cinema production, as well as pictures in news media associated to the COVID-19 pandemic that I have analyzed lately, what is striking is the transmediality and iconicity of narratives of the global North, solving a crisis which is seen as produced in the out there and that threatens the endurance of the we as the leading hierarchically higher component of the humanity. In almost all the films and news about environmental and human-driven catastrophes that could generate the end of history, geography, and humanity, they are overcome only and exclusively through the we knowledge and action. Western knowledge and action, bravery and benevolence are taken acritically, dehistoricized and depoliticized, as if they had nothing to do with the love of profit, which rather appears as peripheral and inconsequential in the struggle of humanity to save its best portion. But this best portion does not exist in nature. It is discursively, or better, semiotically produced through a set of dispositives, which are biopolitical as well as geontologically, meaning able to establish hierarchies that function to legitimize a limitless extractivism of those who and that what is left outside, behind, or beyond the we and its space. I call these dispositives bordering, outsiding, and othering. That is, those cartographic segmentations and their associated walls, borders, carceral archipelagos, as well as those invisible social folds that establish the degree of vulnerability and exposition to that of racialized, gendered, and poor subjects even within specific society. The three dispositives of bordering, outsiding, and othering are intrinsically anthropocenic because they do not function only to separate humans, but to create hierarchies that sustain the moral distinction between humans and their others. That is, everybody and everything, which is seen as threatening and or deemed as expendable for the benefit of the normative human. Consequently, they establish the differential value extraction and the vulnerability to exploration, extractivism, and death that these others may suffer. In fact, I see borders and boundaries fixed by standards of morality and rationality, not only as always gendered, racialized, classed, and sexualized, but also epistemically violent against any other form of life and non-life, against any pluriversal epistemology which may be based on the acknowledgement of the interdependence between human, not human, and the inanimated. Therefore, borders and boundaries enforce not only a human ontology of distance and opposition, but also a geographical ontology of difference. Today, that difference is constantly reenacted in discourses on climate change, environmental catastrophe, terrorism, and poverty in the global south, as if the place of civilization bore no connection to the space in which the crisis occurred, nor any responsibility. But at the same time, as if that naturalized distance was something that is everything but natural and thus needs to be confirmed, kept still, and effective. In my view, this binary rhetoric locating forgettable disasters beyond the borders of the world imagined community is the highest expression of the coloniality of our present. But the Black and brown bodies of today's migrant aliens, as well as those of the homegrown so-called terrorists, and the differential impact of the COVID-19 pandemic within the West are telling the we different stories about the Anthropocene and its apocalypses. Stories that, in the name of the must be saved we, are often disregarded, rejected, denied, and violently silenced. To all these crises and all the new stories, they help emerge and which contest the history, geography, and ideas of humanity of the we. What should feminist responses look like? Responses that could be plural, located, context-based, and simultaneously transnational, that are meant to be at the same time epistemological, political, and material. As a white Italian feminist whose thinking and action are shaped and yet constantly challenged by post-colonial anti-racist and queer feminisms, the only responses I identify are those converging into a political project of interdependent care, self-care, and health care. This project borrows the centrality of care from Western modern feminisms, that is, the importance that the well-being, which is at the same time psychosocial and cultural, sexual and economic, of individuals and communities were considered as a commons to a resource and a social duty beyond the nation state. The issue of care is read here not only through indigenous, Black and working class women and queer critiques, but also through the no-border and anti-capitalist activism and theory. Care should not be the only a national issue. Care has to be thought as transnational and global. It has to be structured by decolonial projects and has to value life in all its pluriverses against colonial, extractivist, and terrorist violence. Finally, it has to be coupled with self-care. Drawing from Sarah Ahmed, from Odolo, the Sarah Ahmed articulations, and I quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." I consider self-care as a feminist project for individual and collective autonomy and care for oneself that integrates care, otherwise structured by heteropatriarchal, racist, capitalist, and colonial gender roles. In the context of migrants and asylum seekers, minorities, decolonial, and anti-patriarchal struggles, local and indigenous resistance against environmental disasters and their neo-colonial securitization, as well as local resistance against organized terror, self-care means individual and collective autonomy, self-preservation, solidarity against state surveillance, discipline and abuse, national and international corporate exploitation, and terrorist co-optation. The political project of interdependent care, self-care, and health care couples anti-authoritarianism with anti-colonial struggles against extractivism, exploitation, and vulnerabilization. Health care, what I do mean with health care, drawing from indigenous pluriverses, political movements, epistemologies like the Kurdish genealogy and Latin American buen vivir, and reconnecting this tradition with some important theoretical contribution by Western intellectuals like Donna Haraway, Stacey Alaimo, Arturo Escobar, Kare Baradi, etc., and many others, fortunately. This plan extends the idea of care to non-human life. This project is based not only on the idea that capitalism and patriarchy with their militarized walls, borders, camps, and carceral archipelagos, system of surveillance, immobility, forced mobility, expropriation, exploitation are essentially racist, but also on the idea that the coloniality of racial capitalism and patriarchy is grounded on a relation with the planet that is only driven by profit and cultural as well as material appropriation. The decolonial and anti-colonial premises of such a political project are thus necessarily anti-extractivist and based on the interdependence and interactivity of human, not human, and inanimate components of the planet. It is only by the triad of care, self-care, and earth care that human responsibility towards human, not human life and non-life becomes a political value. Many global South and indigenous communities, marginalized inhabitants of the global North, and political movements across the planet live up to this political value. This same value allows us to reconsider the interconnectedness of migrations, terrorism, and catastrophes, and the mortal challenge they pose to the history, geography, and ideas of humanity hypostatized by the we. Only a radical planetary political project that acknowledges the deadly monstrosity of racial capitalism and the multiple phases of its disciplinary and military organizations, and recognizes the situatedness and vital multiplicity or fragmentation of the responses to them, is able to actively contrast it. In this context, how to make ethnographic and world cultures museums into spaces of care? Art and culture at large played and play a very important part in aggregating, expressing, circulating collective contestation, alternative epistemologies and practices of care, self-care, and healthcare. How can we help ethnographic and world cultures museums, as well as art museums and galleries, in valorizing these contestations and contrasting themselves the logic and ontologies of the Anthropocene, and converge critique into this political project? As they were in the past, we all wish that art and artifacts, as testifying of the many worlds and epistemologies coexisting on the planet, and as conveying a powerful language against anthropocenic epistemic and material violence, may assemble with the many other languages of resistance and enter the hegemonic as well as the counter-public sphere. But how could they do so without losing their radical charge and their critique of the violence of the Anthropocenic we? How can ethnographic museums and art spaces, which are quintessential places of colonial and capitalist extractivism, domestication, and privilege, nurture that epistemological revolution that grounds the feminist political project of care, self-care, and healthcare? And I'm done here. Thank you very much for your patience.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation that gave us a lot of questions and issues as a museographic or museum. As a cultural institution, how to help, how to vehicle all these topics with our activities. So thank you very much, and maybe we can do the coffee break, and then we can start with the panel one. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. I hope this conference is will continue brilliantly and will be contributed to a very great collective reflection on all these very important topics. Thank you very much. I'll be with you as much as I can, as long as I can.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, welcome back. I'm Gaia Del Pino. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm the curator of the African collection of the Museo delle Civiltà. And today, now I'm going to be the chair of the first panel of this creative study lab. And the name of this panel is Collaborating Through Collection, Worldwide Networks and Cooperation with Source Communities. Please remember to use not the question and answer function on the web. I'm speaking to the people that are following us from online, but the chat, because the question answer function is not really working. And let's come back to the panel now. And the title of the panel, yes, is Collaborating Through Collection, Worldwide Networks and Cooperation with Source Communities. We are going to listen to 3 wonderful and stimulating presentation. And the first one that is going to open the panel is by Maria Camilla de Palma, that is here on our desk. That she is a museum anthropologist, founding director of Castello d'Alberti Museum of World Culture in Genoa, in Italy, Genova, since 1991. She did field research in many places in South America, and she is member of the International Committee for Museum and Collection of Ethnography, as well as founding member of the Italian Society for Ethno-Anthropological Museum and Heritage. She published in the field of museum anthropology, social inclusion, and on the intercultural use of cultural heritage. The presentation that is going to talk about today is Decolonize and Chill, refocusing museum on people, values, and equity relationships. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am honored to be here. And I would like to thank Loretta Paderni, the director of MUCIV, and all the staff who have invited me to this inspiring lab. Decolonize and Chill is the title I borrowed for my paper, taken from the work of a Native American artist, Jake Fragua. We hosted in our last pre-COVID conference from the exhibition Landscapes from Within, organized by Soul of Nations in 2019.
Just a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. For the finissage of this exhibition that took place on purpose on October the 12th, which is a peculiar day in Genova that usually hosts celebration of Christopher Columbus' discovery, inverted commas. He performed in the museum plaza before the city and the inhabitants. The museum is overlooking the sea, and so the city is at its foot. Shall I go on now? Okay. He performed. This is a short part of his 25 minutes performance. He created a map, and then he ignited the gunpowder with which he created the map, a map of the Earth, of the planet, following his indigenous origins, as a spiritual healing. This is what he said. So I thought it was important to start with this 3 minutes fire for... Okay, I hope everybody can see it. Oh, very good. But to go on.
You can use
Oh, okay. I saw the screen being ignited totally, but it is lasting 3 minutes in order to help us follow the fire, following the perimeters, the contour of this map of the Earth. He, on that very day, he wanted to... Am I too far? He wanted to celebrate that day with a step in a new era, a step in an era where Columbus should be celebrated in a different way. And so you can see him silent, smoking, and leaving us with no words, actually. And so this is what I'm going to do, be silent. voce in chat, per cui appena finisce il video proviamo a vedere il collegamento che è stato qui. Ok, possiamo interromperlo? Sta finendo. Ok. Ok. Ora così mi sentite? Mi sentono? Possiamo andare avanti? I thought it was important to start with this performance, but I wanted to point out that since Clifford experience in Portland in 1989 and the indigenous stories and chants being narrated and performed before the museum collections, since the following years in where collections have been more and more interpreted by native voices, and then since the years of contact zone, co-curatorship, dialogue, with dialogic experiences and third zones, since the museum has started to be seen and experienced as a site for deconstruction of the colonial hegemonic narrative, much has been written for taking a more democratic and inclusive path where our certainties are questions, could be questions, where our cannibal role of appropriating collections and their interpretation has come to light, in a world where not only objects lead a nomadic existence, but also the cultures to which they belong. In an era of delocalization and diasporic spheres, we have passed from participatory observation to dialogic and inclusive exhibitions to finally a scene where the makers of the objects are telling their vision and interpretation. It is therefore high time we take new models in our practices. These are the statements that we chose to declare during the last day of the Museum Week last June. And we felt it was time to take this position. We are a city museum, a neo-medieval castle overlooking the sea on top of a hill surrounded by a romantic garden, a residence of a seaman who traveled extensively and built his home over a Renaissance fortification to gather his souvenirs from all over the world and his photographs. The total refurbishment of the museum underwent in 2004. It was the occasion for rethinking the whole narrative behind the collection, including the voices of their makers, starting from the cumbersome colonial legacy, the museum founder and his installations incarnated. An evolutionary scheme underlined along the main stairway with colonial trophies from African and Australian ones at the lower levels and the Oriental ones on the first floor and the Noble Europe at the second floor, was a brilliant solution to conceptualize these people as inferior and legitimate Western intervention to satisfy their urgent need for order and domination. The possession of objects has played a role in assessing Western superiority and power over what we consider the uncivilized and primitive tribes under the colonial rule. Here is the Turkish sitting room that materializes the fascination from the far away countries in the captain's vision in the 19th century approach. But thanks to the ongoing experiences with indigenous people, the First Nations and Australian Aboriginal, as you see here, a second itinerary has taken shape, taking us on a journey into the depth of the construction of our identity. From the 1892 collection donated after Christopher Columbus celebration from the Americas, again Columbus, here the bayou between Venezuela and Colombia helped us understanding what to do with the new museum. Contacts started to be established with the makers of these objects, and we found ourselves here with pottery makers who, in the awareness that a paternalistic voice behind the scene in which to perpetrate the old anthropological, ideological, or religious schemes could not be enough to open a museum. it started to be clear to us how objects can be considered as symbols of complex historical and social relationships. And we found ourselves in a cultural association managed by the inhabitants and the Wayuu, who were the descendants of our objects, and taking part in their rituals. Freezing objects in a distant past was not our goal, also with archaeological collection from the Mayan city of Copan in Honduras, for example, donated again after 1892 Christopher Columbus celebration. They became the object of a unique repatriation through the collaboration of the Peabody Museum and the Instituto Hondureño de Cultura y Antropología, who made our negative molds in order to take the positive copies of two important fragments of the pre-Columbian site for recomposing them in the Museo della Escultura, showing the open nature of museum as institution that shift among leftovers, relics, and lootings, where museum cannot be said innocent in their acquisitions and representations. The Hopi area displayed was shaped thanks to the dialogues and exchanges with the Hopi themselves, including different perspectives on them. The restitution of the photos taken in 1896 by Captain D'Albertis was the first step to establish a dialogue with the Hopi tribe in Arizona. And the former children who had drawn the collection of drawing we received after the opening of the museum. And we started a relationship with Kachina carvers, pottery makers, and even Snake Society priest who developed the exhibition. And here I hope that having a video now will be not a problem. So I'm going on. Showing the opening of the museum with the Hopi presence in their area that was shaped after their contact. If the video can provoke a problem, I think I'll go on and let's try. I'm short in time, so don't worry. We can go on even further a little bit. Okay, thank you very much.
In questa sala, dedicata al gruppo indigeno nordamericano Hopi dell'Arizona, sono esposti diversi materiali storici che testimoniano le raccolte di due personaggi in momenti diversi: il capitano D'Albertis durante il suo secondo viaggio intorno al mondo nel 1896 e il professore Dalla Volta nel corso della sua missione scientifica del 1953. Questi elementi sono stati fondamentali per riaprire il dialogo tra il museo e gli Hopi, che ha permesso non solo di rintracciare i percorsi del capitano e del professore, ma anche di realizzare quest'area rispettando i modelli costruttivi delle case degli Hopi, ricreandone l'atmosfera spirituale e riproponendo una struttura attraverso una visuale dall'alto. Questa richiama le strutture ipogee dove gli Hopi svolgono le loro cerimonie. In camere semisotterranee accessibili dall'alto attraverso un'apertura dal tetto. L'effetto delle loro abitazioni di mattoni cotti al sole è stato creato ricoprendo le pareti del museo con un impasto di sabbia che ne evoca la tecnica di costruzione.
Le vetrine sono collocate su un muretto panca che corre lungo tutto il perimetro esterno, ricordando le sedute delle camere cerimoniali, e l'accesso all'area è delimitato da un muro a gradoni curvilinei che restringono l'ingresso per suggerirne una dimensione sacra e una sua fruibilità ristretta. La forma a T delle vetrine, che infine sono state incassate nel perimetro, la vetrina ricavata nel muro e l'apertura circolare ivi praticata sono state definite alla fine, nella fase di rifinitura dell'allestimento, quando il designer Massimo Chiappetta
ha recepito le proposte degli Hopi e ne ha sintetizzato gli elementi simbolici del paesaggio. Di seguito illustriamo le tappe della ricerca sul terreno del 2002, che ha avuto lo scopo di incontrare coloro che erano stati gli autori dei disegni raccolti dal professore e di riconoscere i luoghi delle fotografie scattate dal capitano, con l'obiettivo finale di coinvolgere gli Hopi nella rappresentazione della loro cultura nel nostro museo.
Nell'estate del 2002, la lunga lista di nomi di persone da rintracciare nella riserva Hopi in Arizona si è piano piano trasformata in volti precisi. Abbiamo chiesto loro di Genova e di un episodio nella loro vita di bambini accaduto nell'estate del 1953, quando il professor Amedeo Dalla Volta, medico dell'Istituto Gaslini di Genova, li ha incontrati e fatti disegnare. Egli conservò scatole piene dei loro disegni, che insieme a oggetti veri e propri quadri, doveva costituire la base per le sue osservazioni sulla genesi del concetto di spazio infinito e della rappresentazione dell'universo infantile, che però non vennero mai elaborati in modo sistematico. Questo materiale, donato dall'Associazione degli Amici del Museo, che lo aveva acquisito dalla famiglia, era destinato a diventare lo strumento per comunicare con gli Hopi e riprendere i contatti con un popolo che già il capitano D'Albertis, durante il suo secondo viaggio intorno al mondo del 1896, aveva incontrato e fotografato. Dalla terra degli Hopi aveva anche portato con sé degli oggetti, ceramiche, utensili e materiali di varia natura, che più di 100 anni dopo quell'estate del 2002 abbiamo loro mostrato in foto, insieme ai disegni fatti fare dal Dalla Volta e alla sua raccolta di Katsina Dolls. Queste sono figurine lignee che rappresentano esseri soprannaturali con cui gli Hopi mantengono relazioni per garantire l'armonia del mondo e ottenere raccolti abbondanti. Vengono intagliate dai padri per le figlie, dalla loro nascita al matrimonio. Le foto scattate dal capitano ci hanno condotto tra gli altipiani rocciosi della Hopiland in compagnia di esponenti del Consiglio tribale a individuare i luoghi da lui percorsi nel 1896. I disegni dei bambini del 1953, con nome e cognome, annotato dal Dalla Volta, ci hanno fatto entrare nelle case, nei negozi, nelle biblioteche e negli uffici sulle tracce delle informazioni che via via raccoglievamo sull'una o sull'altra persona. Senza programmi o finzioni, la cultura degli Hopi si è dispiegata innanzi a noi con un'immediatezza e concretezza inaudita, per rendere chiaro a chiunque che a loro si poteva e doveva dar voce.
Ni wimba ni ina
to our idea and point of view at that time, this is what they look like. And then we had to have people there, spectators, so these little faces up here were watching the snake dance. So this is that picture here.
With the Getty grant received to make this dialogue possible in the museum, we also managed to invite Gerald McMaster, Plains Creek curator and artist, and now professor at OCAD in Toronto, who accepted our invitation to interpret the museum collection from his people, as he did at the Museum of American Indian in New York, Smithsonian Institution, where this photograph was taken of his installation. Spending time together at the Gallery of Museum of Modern Art before selecting the pieces to be exhibited took us in a dialogue, facing exhibiting dilemmas. Here is another video, but it is really too much. But you can see him and the designer of the exhibition. No, okay. And after 1 week interpreting the collection in the museum deposit, this was his final statement. and I'm giving you time to read this. Here I am, and this is who we are today, is inspiring for us every day. We saw him smelling, and here it is where it is written. We saw him smelling the smoked moccasins made of deerskin, waving the leather fringes of a shirt, or the feathers of a headdress, or listening to the rustle of the conical metal bells of a necklace. We felt the objects expanding to their natural environment and to the space surrounding them. We perceived their value in their life with man today. And when we opened the museum, our senses were more open. Entering the home of Captain D'Albertis, we had reconstructed in these days, is now putting us together with them in the narrative, exploring our relationship with the other in time. And here are the installations of the colonial trophies. And then looking at the incredible view through the eyes of Christopher Columbus today, with a new interpretation, or making the Turkish sitting room alive with the presence of new inhabitants. Provoking a surprise with a back X-ray under the pre-Hispanic funerary finds of the area created excavating the fortification, where gunports host site-specific installation according to a different exhibition approach from Captain's point of view, creating a more spiritual environment thanks to a half-circular seating like this, or hosting vases in a coiled case resembling the belly of the pots and the technique of modeling them without the wheel, as it is still done today, like in pre-Hispanic times. Or giving the sense of uneasiness to a visitor accustomed in appropriating art with his gaze, making him surrounded by clay busts with no head nor eyes that can make you feel observed and attacked altogether. Or refusing the romanticized image of Native Americans, the one that we are stereotyped, we are accustomed to have seen stereotyped in the photographs of 1 century, paying respect to them with images of their sacred landscape. Or with educational activities connected with music, together with migrant musicians. Or with the ethnomusic garden, which welcomes visitors with his music while sitting. Other occasions for experiencing museums as agents of social change are temporary exhibitions, like the first one, where historical artifacts of the Salesian missionaries taken out of their deposit, let's say cemeteries, where hundreds of identical items recall the looting perpetrated against the Bororo people and many other people because of the theft of their ritual and daily use objects with the clear intention of deculturating and destroying their culture. We wanted to point out the unrespectful display of secret sacred items like these bones and body parts taken out of real ritual entombments. And we wanted to facilitate the contact and relationship between historical knowledge and of elders and younger generations in order to remake objects and reinvigorate knowledge and techniques with an exhibition that narrated this process, and also the repatriation of 12 historical objects to the Bororo in the reservation that are hosted in a central glass case of the exhibition. In this way, we gave voice to indigenous knowledge and interpretation, to missionary encyclopedic research, and to anthropologist records for having multiple perspectives on the collections. And we had the chance to have the Bororo help us cataloging the collection together in the deposit, incorporating their information on our historical collection. And here they are welcoming the people and going to visit Claude Lévi-Strauss, donating him a necklace that is usually donated to Bororo leaders. Collaborating with migrant citizens for public programs during exhibition is another challenge we are trying to cope with every time we plan an exhibition. Here are, as you can see, I'm going quickly, ways of making objects get out of the cases rather than making them just objects in a way. Or building relationships over hot issues such as female genital mutilations with a community of migrant women inhabiting the neighborhood of the castle, of the museum. Or meeting African visitors interested in understanding the community lamp designed by an Italian architect in Mali, recycling bicycle and TV parts, responding to the request of the villagers for their activities. And welcoming then African migrants from Brianza who came to send the picture to their mother so that they can learn how to build this lamp for their uses with a special kit for the purpose that the Italian architect prepared. Or working with Malian migrants behind the scene, or working with Mohamed Keita, an Ivorian photographer who is earning his life teaching to teenagers in the street in Africa like him how to find their passion and make it a tool for survival, thanks with Civico Zero here in Rome, by the way. Or working with the Ecuadorian Shuar, who chose to be photographed with their survival symbols, seeds and plants, and the planet and the taking care of the planet message that they are giving. Okay. I am going very quickly now because you have had a glimpse in our activities, and I want to go back to the final point. Or being challenged by the presence of Latin American high school students who asked us, paraphrasing James Clifford's sentence, why it has seemed obvious that pre-Hispanic objects should be preserved in European museums, even when this means that no fine specimens are visible in Peru and Ecuador, in our countries. And this led us to a repatriation process that took more than 4,000 objects, pre-Columbian Hispanic objects, being repatriated, and working together with the community and the embassy, or working together with association as a side activities of temporary exhibition with the Turkish community, for example, of arranging tours in the city led by migrant citizens and their lens and biographical approach to the city. Near Christopher Columbus, this Ecuadorian lady is pointing out the Americas, and it's really inspiring to see how they make it contemporary to them. I'm coming from Peru, from very far, and here in Genova I can find my country, as many other countries that I love, Africa, Asia, and many more. This is my new city, my adoptive city. It is a mixture of all this, and this is why I feel comfortable here. I feel at home, and my home is the home of everybody. This is the biographical approach we are working with, thanks to Ecuadorian, African, or Venezuelan, or Refugees Welcome is another approach in our daily activity. Here is a tour with a performance by Federica Loredan, a dancer, with her exhibition under the title Mermaids, which symbolizes the identity of refugees that are between the earth and the sea, like mermaids. Or a Peruvian dancer who is performing in front of them and their families assembled in the hall of the museum. And last, our collaboration with First Nations painters, contemporary First Nations artists like Antoinette Fragua, introducing the university students the exhibition, exactly the Colonize and Chill of the beginning. And she's performing during the opening, where here she is with Jake Fragua, and the exhibition hosted cases transformed into talks, totem talks, where people could answer to the questions asked by the artists themselves. And in all languages, they were covered by reactions and interactions. Or Uncovering America, Uncovering America's project with a Ligurian artist and a Navajo artist who on October the 12th revealed their real identity of Native American cultures reciprocally, unveiling history. This is a program who is in progress, following Rebecca Belmore, an Anishinaabe gallery curator in Ontario and in Winnipeg. We are trying to avoid the word Indian in our labels in the museum, in collaboration with Pine Ridge Reservation community. I have not much to show you yet, but in the future, sure. Taking care was the subject of one of the subject of this project, with musicians, independent curators, and cultural welfare workshops. It Takes 1,000 Voices to Tell a Single Story was the title of the exhibition, with an Argentinian artist, Gabriela Acha, living in Den Haag, questioning the role of museum today, and immaterial cultural heritage carried on her back, on the side of Christopher Columbus' sculpture, looking at the horizon where America is. Or meeting visitors, and I'm thanking Christopher for allowing me to use this, meeting special visitors like this with her cultural heritage, immaterial cultural heritage on the back. Part of this welfare, cultural welfare workshop was working with the culture of the deaf culture and deaf language. And this is a performance of visual vernacular. It would be great to have time, and I'm not doing it, I'm finishing it, but I wanted just to point out that this same approach we use with First Nations was adopted with deaf people, because we have realized that they belong to a different culture, and they pointed out that they are not Italian. So that's why I incorporated this quick hint to this. And visual repatriation of last century pictures to communities of origin in Italy is part of our giving back approach, thanks to the pictures of Captain D'Albertis taken in Italy as well. So starting from the Hopi repatriation, we go back to Valtellina, Sardinia, or to Fiuggi. And so giving voice now to the next talk. I'm just speaking quickly of the next exhibition, starting with the vision of Captain D'Albertis' first tour of the world in 1878, which you can find in a scrapbook, not a photo album, a patchwork of newspaper clippings, menu, notes, letters, carte de visite, tickets of theater, of trains, sleeping cars, steamships, receipts of purchases, luggage claim receipt, colonial trophies, stereotyped images of Japanese photographs and objects, and also the starting point to a new narrative, the receipt by the captain of staged photographs taken by Lind in Australia, Melbourne. This is the captain, photographed by Lind, and these are the objects he took there, and here are the photographs. Starting from this, we are opening up a new narrative thanks to the works of Monica Galassi and her graduation work together with an Aboriginal consultant, Marika Dushinsky, where these pictures, signs of appropriations, will lead us to a new vision. And also the landscape pictures tell us a lot about the European connotations they have got. Look at how beautiful they are. But these are the captain's pictures, and even an Aboriginal woman laughing at him or behaving like this in front of his camera will help us incorporate the voices of the Aboriginal descendants of the staged photographs, thanks to the work of Ken Orchard and Kate Graham that have been written this catalogue after the recognitions of the descendants in the collection of the Grafton Regional Gallery photograph, a portfolio that is very similar to ours, and I must say, to yours. So you will, Loretta Paderne is not here, but we have already started a process with Monica. She will talk about it. And Monica is really, I'm finishing. Monica will be, Monica is, as suggested, to incorporate the Genevieve Grieve reenactment work of art of today's staged photography. This is just to give an idea of her platform, digital restitution. And this will be the last slide to show how we will introduce the visitors to respect and acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. Sorry for taking so long.
No, Monica, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Maria Camilla. And I apologize for the problems we had at the beginning. So sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you for your stimulating presentation. Sorry again. And now let's start with Monica Galassi, that she's an Italian anthropologist who has been working in Australia to support Aboriginal self-determination and sovereignty in collecting institutions. She's passionate about finding ways to foster culturally safe and community-driven initiatives across the cultural sector through research-led practice. In 2020, Monica was awarded as a research excellence scholarship to undertake a PhD in the field of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander archival records, which are held in Italian Museum and Archives, as Maria Camilla was telling us now. Monica's presentation is Aboriginal Archives in Italy, a space for reciprocal collaboration. Thank you, Monica. It's for you now, the time.
Nice, thank you. Can you hear me and see the PowerPoint, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. The usual question at the beginning. Good morning, everyone. And thank you both to Dr. Maria Camilla De Palma for the introduction, and also to Dr. Gaia Giuliani. Both speech notes were absolutely amazing, and they really resonated with me. I took a lot of note about how important is the idea of the others, the centrality of the West, the relationship with power, the importance of recognizing our privilege. So thank you all for sharing these ideas. So my name is Monica Galassi, and I would like to share with you today the research project I'm working on, and also my professional practice at the University of Technology, Sydney. I'm currently working at the Jambana Institute for Indigenous Education Research in the same university. My research, it's about archival records about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, and they are now held in Italy. And of course, thank you to the organizer, to the Taking Care project. I'm very happy to be here. I would have preferred to be in Rome physically, but that's okay anyway. And thank you to Dr. Loretta Paderni for the invite as well. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the land of the Gadigal people in the area that now we call the inner west of Sydney in Australia. And I pay my respect to all elders past and present and emerging. And just a couple of days ago, I actually had the chance to have a beautiful conversation with Dr. Maria Camilla De Palma and an Aboriginal colleague, Gamilaroi woman, Marika Duchiski, on why it is relevant to acknowledge country and Aboriginal sovereignty when working with these collections. And even if we are not, physically located in Australia or in Aboriginal land, as I should say. So the artwork I'm showing on the screen is held at the State Library of New South Wales in Sydney, and remind me of that conversation. This is one of the first known testimony of an early Aboriginal point of view of the colonization of Australia. And it was considered and celebrated because it was collected by an institution, but there is no voice from the artist or his descendant. So this reminds me of how much power we have, how much power there is in choosing and privileging narratives, and how many incredible stories still remain untold. But speaking about my own story, so positioning myself in this project and in this research, I was born and grew up in Italy. My journey in this field started in 2009 when I moved to Gadigal country to work in the field of Aboriginal archives. And for me, this interest was sparked thanks to the many Indigenous scholars and activists that all around the world, not just only in Australia, expose the vital importance of control and transparency over their historical information to achieve concrete social justice. And I've been working in different cultural institutions in these years, government or government with archival records, but also cultural objects and collections held in Aboriginal regional keeping places and galleries. So when starting working in this space, I learned straight away that positioning myself is fundamental because, as Professor Larissa Brents remind non-Indigenous researchers like myself, that Indigenous approaches to knowledge understand that where you're placed will fundamentally influence the way how you see the world. And so in this way, the importance of my standpoint has been key in my experience of migration in Australia. Because this journey forced me at looking at matters of self-representation and agency as a migrant to Australia and also as an uninvited guest in an Aboriginal nation. And this includes obviously being a citizen of a country like Italy, which has a colonial past, but doesn't recognize itself as such. And so that's my interest in, I have great interest in the work of the Museo delle Civiltà, and I know so many of you, they're there in Rome and listening to the conference online. I've been doing groundbreaking work in this space in terms of nation building. So all this reflection ended up on rethinking on my professional role and on how I could continue to support Aboriginal aspirations within the cultural sector, but aware of my own bias. So in 2011, I started a collaboration with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Data Archive to identify Aboriginal Australian collections held in Italy, and the scope was to create the first mapping of this institution. So among more known cultural heritage held in museum, there was also some intangible heritage that I didn't know before. At that time, some institutions were incredibly interested and collaborative, while others showed less interest. And some of these tensions were, of course, about a different cultural, legal, and historical background between Italy and Australia. But also, some others implied the complexities which are still embedded in the overall conversation, not only around Indigenous knowledge held in Europe, but more in general, around power dynamics deep-seated in colonial collecting institutions. And this included, of course, tension related to repatriation of objects and all people held in museum, as they are usually called by communities, human remains. And to me, this is very important to acknowledge when dealing with difficult narratives and memories. Because as Foucault warned us, there is power in knowledge, there is power in knowledge production, and there is power in ownership, this knowledge, and in the decision that we make every day on what to make accessible and what not. Because as we all know, museums are not neutral. But some Italian colleagues also share with me many practical challenges that are very hard to overcome, and there are stoppers for international collaborations. And some of those included difficulties on finding and linking these collections, including the archival records that are held in museum and are often part of the internal documentation in the museum. Sometimes it's not digitized, and it's just very hard to increase access to this material. So over the years, I've been yarning with Aboriginal people and community members I was working with about the archival records held in Italy. And I asked if they knew that they existed and if they would have been interested in knowing more. So in general, the responses show a lot of interest and curiosity over what Italian museums and other cultural institutions hold. And likewise, some Italian institutions and colleagues and researchers also showed interest in establishing a relationship with communities and for deepening the understanding of their Australian collection. But at that point, my focus centered on archives, because during my work, my last decade in Australia, I witnessed, but cannot speak, of course, for my Aboriginal colleagues' desire of accessing and responding to archival records that contain information about them and their families and their ancestors. What I observed was that records can be absolutely incredibly traumatic for people, for the information they contain, but also there is a real thirst for knowing where this information is. And of course, this gap is even more visible when we're speaking about countries that didn't participate directly in the Australian colonial project, and in particular when they speak languages other than English, like Italy. And this ongoing conversation also challenged my idea of what an archival record is. Different people in this over the last years asked me help because they had Aboriginal Italian heritage, and they couldn't actually find the birth certificate or their grandparents that were held in small Italian archives. And that experience teach me about my own bias in using, for example, Western framework when categorizing knowledge. So this conversation has led me to reflect on the need of opening up a transnational space of dialogue about these archives, but to do so in a different way, to do so in a way that centers Aboriginal worldviews, voices and aspirations, and that could support self-determination and sovereignty. So I started reflecting on how I could have contributed to forge a space where Indigenous way of knowing an Italian archival tradition could converge through understanding and translating concepts and needs. I would call it like a sort of a cultural interface using the groundbreaking concept of Torres Strait Islander professor Martin Nakata. So what I wanted to do was to overcome the transactional view of digital return and the state-based thinking towards centering relationships to provide access and exchange knowledge. So in my research and in my work, the process starts acknowledging power and shifting perspective. And both decolonizing methodologies and critical theories open up opportunities for imagining collaboration between museums and communities that are both culturally safe and in which priority are determined by Indigenous peoples. The groundbreaking work of Ngāti and Ngāti Pro Maori academic Linda Tuhiai-Smith has given me a great lens and give to all non-Indigenous researchers a great lens to actually acknowledge this power. So that's how the research the research project Aboriginal Archives in Italy really was born. In my research, I am to observe what happens when we open spaces for dialogue between Italian institutions and the Aboriginal communities who are connected to the stories held in these archives. And which hard conversations do we need to have to establish trust? And here I'm speaking, for example, about Indigenous intellectual property, matters of informed consent, right to know, right to respond to these records, cultural protocols. It's kind of feeling that these conversations are always probably spoken in Indigenous context, are definitely spoken in institutions, but when there is actually the opportunity to converge these conversations. Other questions that I'm trying to explore in this research project is, what are the desires for a future space of exchange, digital and physical, between Italy and Australia for communities, but also for Italian institutions? And using the colonial lens, of course, giving back to communities is the first fundamental step. And that's why I'm now working with 3 Italian institutions in museums to find, organize, and contextualize a sample of their Aboriginal archival collections with the aim of making connections to Aboriginal communities and let them know about these records. So the site you can see on the screen, and it's publicly available, contains a digital archive, but it's a prototype which is in constant evolution and has been conceived as a digital space to encourage access, conversations, and multiple narrative about these records. This is also the site will be shown also in the exhibition that Dr. Maria Camilla De Palma was speaking about, to actually show to the Italian public how the process of reconnecting these records with communities, because I really believe that the process is it's important as much as the actual result. I would like to thank the partner institutions that are working with me in this journey. So the D'Albertis Museum in Genova, the Museo delle Civiltà, Pigorini in Rome, and the Podensana Ethnographic Museum in La Spezia, and in particular Maria Camilla De Palma, Loretta Paderni, Claudio Mancuso, Mario Mineo, Giacomo Paulicchi, but also there are so many people that have been involved in this process over the years. Many First Nation community members, archivists, academics, and also Italian and European researchers who has really shared with me knowledge and ideas. And I've been learning so much already in this journey. We are just at the beginning, but new stories are already emerging. Stories of connections among these institutions, stories of newly discovered provenance, and knowledge from communities that are already giving a name to many stories that otherwise were forgotten. So I would like to conclude today just saying, repeat the initial question. So yes, ethnographic museums have a key role to play in dealing with difficult memories and supporting truth-telling and social justice, not only in Australia, but on a global scale. And my hope for this project is to be able to contribute to future conversation about it. And reading all the abstracts and the experiences of all speakers today remind me how there is still so much to do to recognize the transactional relationships among European countries and colonial powers, which were all involved directly or indirectly in the subjugation, exploitation, not only of Australia, but so many colonies of people around the world. And as the 2 keynote speakers says before me today, this exploitation continue today, and we have been all benefited from it. So I think centering relationship and different ways of knowing in our work really provide incredible opportunities to stay relevant as institutions, but also to truly contribute to social justice. So thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you to you, Monica. Yes, I agree. There is a lot to do to build up these relations.